I'm very pleased to introduce Alexandra Jones, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Archaeology in the Community. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay. Founder and chief executive officer of Archaeology in the Community, a nonprofit organization that promotes and facilitates the study and public understanding of archaeological heritage through educational programs and community events in the Washington, D.C. area. She is an education leader focused on community outreach and service, and has taught in multiple educational environments from primary schools to museums, colleges, and camps. She obtained dual BA degrees from Howard University in history and anthropology, and an MA in history also from Howard, as well as a PhD in historical archaeology from the University of California, Berkeley. Alexandra worked for PBS's television show Time Team America, so you might recognize her, during the 2013 season as the archaeology field school director, instructing junior high and high school students. She is currently an assistant professor at Baltimore City Community College and adjunct professor at the University of Baltimore, and I welcome Alexandra.
So good afternoon, I guess that's where we're at now. Yeah, good afternoon. What I will say is I didn't have a few of the papers. I actually just read them for the first time along with you. So some of my comments are going to be a little bit more off the cuff versus as formalized. But I wanted to start kind of with the theme, Revealing Communities, the Archaeology of African Americans in the 19th century. And to me, I thought this symposium was very fitting, considering it's Black History Month. This symposium was set up to celebrate African American life in the U.S. The papers being presented have highlighted the resilience, the strength, and the tenacity of members of the African American diaspora to thrive in an environment which was met at every turn to tear them down. This symposium really reminds me of Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise. And if you bear with me for a second, for those who've never heard it, you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons, like suns, with this certainty of tides, just like hoops springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed, head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I rise. Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, willing and swelling I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave me. I am the dream of the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise, I rise. So in thinking about this poem, what brings to bear are the papers that were given by Christopher, that were given by Meredith. In addition to that, Jones, as well as Rebecca's work on the African American communities and the resilience of these communities to kind of continue. Specifically looking at Meredith and the Seneca Valley community that was left but forgotten in history. What you have are scholars that are now bringing to bear the story of those people who lived in Seneca Valley and now giving back kind of their voice. Excuse me. What I also like to bring up, and I thought it was interesting, that was also brought up by a audience member, is the Seneca Value piece highlights the larger problem, which is that local governments and state governments historically have taken land from African Americans, whether this is private, important places of African American memory and or African American burial grounds, and destroyed them in the name of the greater good of the larger community. This has become such a rapid problem that current day we actually have the African Burial Ground Network Act that's before the House that is set to protect African American burial grounds. I bring this up because this is a problem that we see continue, not only when it relates to property and land rights, but also who owns the past. Heritage management, heritage preservation. And Chris actually brought this up when he was talking, the struggle for African American communities to gain heritage preservation recognition. A lot of the afternoon papers will deal with activism and working directly with the communities and getting this done. A lot of us, including myself, I'm currently working with the community trying to save a burial ground. And I also know Matt will talk about his struggles as well doing that. It is something that is super hard. Trying to argue to people why your heritage and your past is important and should be saved when it's not something that's argued when it comes to other people's heritage and past, and especially burial grounds. In discussing, the lives of African Americans, what I would like to highlight are 2 points. Free African Americans were not homogeneous groups. And we see that identified in Rebecca's work as well as Jones' work, the diversity that's within these groups. One of the things that I would like to highlight, and I saw it very well done in their papers, is intersectionality. You're talking about groups that are of different classes, different religious backgrounds, that are very distinct. So moving away from the constant concept of talking about African American or free African Americans as this homogeneous group, as if everybody did the same, believed the same. With that, I also bring up the argument of Herstovitz and Fraser, the idea of Africanisms. One of the things that we continue to hear is this constant looking for West African connections. And what I actually loved was it was brought up in, I think it was Jones' paper about the church and how in the looking at the AME church and how they actually pushed against that. Thinking about the idea of like the talented 10th and the idea that you had some scholars during that time period who actually said, let's not continue this because this is how we're looked down upon. So how does that also reflect in the archaeological record? And being careful that we don't always immediately jump to Africanisms when looking at sites and place of African American heritage. The second point that I want to bring up is the example that free African Americans weren't free. They constantly lived under the guise or constantly lived under the idea of Euro-American acceptance. Had to constantly worry about that and worry about understanding not that they could not step out of the cage of that was created by the Euro-American dominant society for fear of being punished or killed. And we see examples of this time and time again throughout the 19th century. You have Black Wall Street in Tulsa. You have an Atlanta, Arkansas massacre. You have the Rosewood massacre also that took place in Florida. This forced them into a life where they were constantly aware of their positionality. Du Bois best describes this in his phrase double consciousness, in which he talks in his article in 1897, during the time period in which we're talking. He's actually writing about what's going on. And he says, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil, gifted with second sight in this American world. And the world which yields him no self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a particular sensation, the double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others and measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks at it in amused contempt and pity. One feels its two-ness, an American and a Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two waning ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the African American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to obtain self-consciousness, manhood, to merge his double self into a bitter and true self. And I will point out that Gow tries to capture this struggle in his argument with African American identity, highlighting the Cooper family and how they strive to live in a Euro-American dominated. And in this, he juxtaposes the stark differences between the private lives in the home and the public life they're forced to navigate as free African Americans within a Euro-American society, which still views African Americans at this time period as property, because you still do have enslaved people walking around. In thinking about this, the one thing that I did come to and that I was kind of reminded of was Audre Lorde's quote, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the house. They may only allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." As we move through these papers this morning, I would have liked to hear more papers referring to African American scholars, historians, archaeologists, and theorists, meaning setting the material in the actual theories for the time period by intellectuals who actually talked about these at this time. Creole synthesis is a theory created by Smith, a music scholar, which attempts to explain white cultural appropriation of African American culture and arts, particularly in the roots of blackface minstrelsy. This theory is steeped in colonial ideology and shouldn't be used to explain African American culture. Beyond period scholars, there are also tons of work created by African American scholars in religious studies, so we can move beyond Leone and Fry and stating everything is either related to Bakongo religious practices when there are numerous other diasporic religions that would better explain our archaeological findings. I will point out Linder and his students in their paper and poster point out numerous examples of tangible religious practices. In addition, they do a wonderful job of pulling from scholars, various religious scholars, to explain the diversity of practices taking place at their site, whether they're religious or medicinal. In addition, what I really appreciated was the use of, I think it was Rebecca's work talking about the chamber pots, how you took something small as a chamber pot and then developed it into a full story about the African American community, aided by works created by African American scholars in order to illuminate and add a complete story about the community and not just these pots and what was there. In 2005, I gave a paper to SHA, and I'll just quote myself. We need to evaluate our educational background and become well-versed in the histories of people in which we are studying. Students pursuing a career in African American or African diasporic archaeology need to institute and enroll in African American and African diasporic studies courses, regardless of the university's established requirements. In addition, professors need to insist that their students have a core part of their curriculum, a myriad of these courses. In an effort to become conscientious, we need to be careful about and be warned not to fall in the trap of false empathy. We frequently empathize with the people that we are researching. However, it can be a very dangerous thing when one does not remember that knowledge of a situation does not mean the same as the lived experience. Hence, citing scholars from the period in which you are studying adds a whole nuance in which would actually take our archaeology that much further than what we've already done. I was very elated by the second half of presentations that were presented and how nuanced, how in-depth the scholars had gone into the lives of the communities in order to give a holistic view of the African American community beyond just what the artifacts were telling us and beyond what just other archaeologists have cited. Last night, a number of scholars were issued a challenge by a wise old woman. Excavate yourself and your heritage, and use the same care that you conduct that research to also conduct the research of other peoples and their families.